I think, let me start by just saying, I work on an initiative in the UN, which is called Global Pulse, which you could essentially think of as a kind of R&D lab for learning how to harness all of the new emerging technologies and all of the new kinds of data that are out there to gain a real-time understanding of human well-being. That's our ultimate goal. A better understanding of what's happening to people now when their lives are getting better or taking a turn for the worse. To follow on Utku's lead about this new global context we find ourselves in, in a rough approximation, we spent a lot of the 90s wiring up the world. We spent a lot of the first decade of this new millennium building software tools, applications to take advantage of that new connectivity. They've given us the power to self-organize in real time, to interact with each other and share information, make decisions and use information in spectacular ways. But they've also changed the paradigm in ways that are neither clearly good nor clearly bad. We find that shocks can emerge and propagate around the world and interact with one another and with factors such as climate change in ways that can be very, very harmful. A volcano erupts in Iceland, stopping traffic in Europe, and flower sellers in Kenya lose $2 million a week unable to sell their flowers to Europe. A man sets himself on fire in Tunis, and governments fall. It's a very different world. And we have this new global volatility and uncertainty where we've connected ourselves at such a level that predictive analysis is of little use. What we do still have is our ability to adapt. But adaptation takes real-time feedback. And while what we're seeing in the private sector is all of these new technologies and all of this new data that can tell us in real time how our customers responded to that new ad, in the public sector, we haven't begun to harness these new opportunities. What we have and have used for years and years are traditional statistics. The elephant in the room with the MDGs, of course, is that they're based on statistical tracking mechanisms. A lot of these indicators are from 2007. We won't know whether we hit all of them until probably 2020. And the question is, how can we augment what we're doing with all of this new data out there to give us the ability to understand when people are in trouble and what kind of assistance they need? How many of you on the tech side are familiar with the concept of agile development? So, agile is about building technology by interacting with your users very closely. And you get rapid feedback, and you keep changing and adapting your design, and you get it right sooner. What would it mean to do agile global development? If we could harness this new world of data to understand when our programs and policies are and are not working, we could get the design right sooner and know that we're on track and know whether what we're doing is making a difference. So at Global Pulse, we've set ourselves up as a kind of lab to experiment, to learn through trial and error. And the error is important because success is a poor teacher. To learn what works, what doesn't, and why. In terms of looking at new data, we've begun a whole series of experiments in partnership with private sector and with academia to try out new things. And we're seeing some really interesting results so far. While everybody's out there looking at brand perception and sentiment analysis in new data to understand whether our new service is appealing to our customers, we're asking questions like, what patterns show up in data when people are losing their jobs, are unable to afford food or medicine, are having to pull their kids out of school to work in the market? What shows up? If you imagine it's 2009 at the height of the financial crisis, you're a mobile carrier in sub-Saharan Africa. What could that data have told us if we'd known what to listen for? People who normally put $10 a month on their SIM cards, suddenly shifting to 50 cents every few days, and then drawing down their balance on their mobile phones, perhaps defaulting on their microloan repayments that they've worked so hard to qualify for. We think there are a lot of signals out there, and we can't use this information unless we're able to protect privacy and anonymity, as well as the competitiveness of the private sector, who have a lot of the data that is, we believe, holds the most potential here. But we think there's a tremendous opportunity to bring this new world of real-time analytics to bear on understanding global development issues. So we've started to look at some analysis, and it's really interesting. It turns out that calling patterns and anonymized and aggregated data from mobile phones can actually be very strongly correlated with age group and gender and level of socioeconomic development. You can tell who is out there and how they are doing in an anonymous way that we believe could be very powerful for tracking development. We've studied a series of experiments essentially analyzing unemployment statistics against what people talk about online. And people talk about stuff online you wish they wouldn't talk about online. And we live in a very transparent age. But the fact of the matter is we've been applying sentiment analysis technology to over 40,000 blogs where people said, I lost my job, or some version of that. And what we've seen so far is about 3 months before people lose their jobs, there's a spike in depression. And a month before, there's a spike in anxiety. People know. But we've never been able to actually see that pattern emerge. And 6 months afterward, we're already seeing some signs that you see an increase in certain kinds of conversations, like public transportation. So we see this opportunity to use some of this new data to really understand not only when people are in trouble, but how these kinds of global shocks that seem to strike wave after wave these days are actually affecting people's lives. We've also started looking at new technologies. There are a lot of great open source tools out there, but one that we'd certainly like to engage with you in thinking about how to get right is a tool called HunchWorks. And this is an open source platform that we've been building together with design volunteers from Adaptive Path and a number of open source hackers who show up on Monday nights for code jams at our office. And HunchWorks is based on a very simple idea. It's based on a very simple problem statement, which is, in general, by the time we have hard evidence that something is happening, it's too late to act. Right? We live in a world of weak signals. A lot of experts out there have a hunch that something's going on. And there's data indicating that there might be something going on, but it's not hard evidence yet. The puzzle pieces are scattered. And by the time we assemble them, the problem is often has already progressed to the point that harm has been done. So we thought about how could we create a safe space where people could share hypotheses that something was happening and share something that might be evidence that it's happening, but without requiring them to do it in a very public way and put their professional reputation on the line. We see an opportunity in the power of social networking. We thought, what if we could build a social network application that would allow you to create a hypothesis, attach it to some evidence, files, sets of data, photographs, satellite imagery, links to online resources, and then share that with your network, with friends of your friends, to let them then come and attach their own evidence to support or refute what you're saying, to tag it, to comment on it, to rate it, to vote on it, why I think this might be true or why not, where else could it also be happening. Essentially, we're hoping to use the trusted circle of one's own social network community as a kind of safe space where people can share hypotheses, and we can crowdsource evidence from across people within these communities of practice. We're also hoping to use a lot of new machine learning technologies to match up people's profiles, not to find people who see the same way, but people who have different perspectives. Because what we really need is complementarity. So HunchWorks is underway. We're just moving toward our first alpha release of this in the beginning of November. If you're interested in getting involved in the project, we think it's a very grown-up use of social networking technology. We're going to be integrating early with LinkedIn. Facebook is sort of down the road, but we think this could be a really powerful tool that would be useful for us, but also for a lot of business applications as well. It's going to be open source and free. It's something that can be integrated into other platforms. And we'd love to get you involved if you're interested. Finally, talking about change. One of the problems we face in the world, and certainly in our mission in Global Pulse, is that there's a lot of data out there. We talk about this ocean of data that we're all swimming in. But that, increasingly, while people share tons of information online, a lot of the data that's out there is accreting behind corporate firewalls, right? Most of the really interesting data for understanding how people are doing is being generated by their using services, digital services. And that's what corporations hold on to for dear life. That's their intellectual property. That's their edge. And it's a very powerful edge. But if you look out there, what can we actually see of the total, what's the fraction of data that's publicly available? I mean, no one really knows. It's a little bit like, astronomers tell us, we look out through a telescope and we see the universe shining back at us. But there's this thing called dark matter out there, and 4/5 of the universe is stuff that we can't see. How much of the data that's out there in our digital universe can we see through search engines? Very little. So we've begun to engage with the private sector around an idea that we call data philanthropy. Data philanthropy. And it's the basic idea here is, look, we live in this volatile context where policymakers, communities, by the time anyone knows what's happening, harm has already been done. If government, for example, isn't able to implement the kinds of policies to protect people from shocks, and we lose 10 years of progress toward the MDGs in the community because we didn't know what was happening until it was too late, that's a catastrophic loss for human development. It's also really bad for business. If you're a mobile carrier in Brazil and you're building towers out into an emerging markets area where you're counting on people to subscribe to your services, and unbeknownst to you, something is happening, a food shortage, for example, and people are having to sell off their property and migrate for work, falling back into poverty, they can't afford your services. What if it turned out that data you were collecting all along from these new mobile subscribers actually contained evidence that could have been used if properly analyzed and protected to reveal the kind of assistance that they needed, what trade-offs they were making, what sacrifices they were making, a lot earlier than the traditional household surveys. So we've begun to engage with the private sector on this idea, to ask this question, what could you share? Is there a way for you to share some of what you know? Not necessarily the raw data, but some analysis of what you have that could help us get a kind of heat map of where problems are emerging. It's not a substitute for statistics, right? It's just like public health. People not coming into work, not coming into school, buying more of certain drugs. Maybe it's flu season. But that's not where you declare it flu season. It's a way to say, something's happening here, let's go get the laboratory samples, let's take them, let's test them, and then we can confirm. We think we have a similar opportunity here to use some of this new data as a way to alert us and target asking the important questions sooner than we're able to today. And we think that this concept of data philanthropy could be key. Now, it's not necessarily the private sector joining the open data movement. There have been a few examples of this. Nike held an open data hackathon in San Francisco last year. It was really exciting to see. And people are starting to talk about what data, transparency and why greater transparency on the part of corporations is probably good for them as well as everybody else. But we also think there are different models. You could mine data behind your own firewalls for patterns that experts in the UN and others in the development community could tell you, are concerning. And then share what you're learning with an organization that could go and validate that information without you ever having to share it publicly. But this is an area where we have to get the incentives right. And if your interest is protecting vulnerable populations, you can't increase their vulnerability. So we have to make sure that the information is used in a way that does no harm. We have to make sure that it's used in a way that businesses see as not just another form of corporate social responsibility, but as something that's really good for business, as a strategy to mitigate risk, for business continuity, for knowing that your workforce and your customers are going to be there for the long haul. It's an area we'd love to engage with you in conversation over the next couple of days. We're very excited to get your ideas. The incentive model has got to be right. Love to get your thoughts. Thank you very much.